There are places in this world that belong to people not because a piece of paper says so, but because their sweat is in the soil and their dead are on the hill. A deed can be taken. A cabin can be torn down. But there are things beneath the surface that no court and no company can reach, if you have the sense to build them deep enough and the will to stay when everyone expects you to leave. In the coal fields of eastern Kentucky, land was the one thing that mattered, and the one thing that was never safe. The coal companies wanted what was under the ground, the seams of black rock that burned hot and sold dear. They bought mineral rights for pennies. They leased surface rights with contracts written in language that no farmer could read. And when a family fell behind on taxes, which happened often in a place where cash money was as rare as summer snow, the county judge could seize the property and sell it at auction to whoever was standing on the courthouse steps with a checkbook. That buyer was almost always the coal company. The family was almost always gone by nightfall. Pike County had seen it happen 100 times, 1,000 times. Families that had lived on the same patch of hillside since before the Civil War turned out with nothing but what they could carry. The men went to the mines in West Virginia or Ohio. The women went to relatives or to the poorhouse in Pikeville. The children scattered like seeds thrown on rock, and the land, the garden, the orchard, the cabin, the graves on the ridge, all of it became company property, fenced off with wire and posted with signs that said, "No trespassing," in letters big enough to read from the road. Dovie Napier was 17 years old when Judge Burke Dameron took her land. Her father, Herschel Napier, had built the cabin on Shelby Creek in 1922. He was a coal miner at the Elkhorn operation up the hollow, but he was also a man who thought further ahead than most. He had grown up watching families get pushed off their places, and he had sworn it would not happen to his. He bought the land outright, 3 acres of bottomland and hillside. With cash he saved over 4 years of working double shifts underground. He built the cabin with his own hands, board by board. He dug a garden and planted apple trees and put up a fence to keep the deer out. And then he did something else. He dug a cellar. Not the ordinary kind. Not a shallow hole under the cabin for storing potatoes through the winter. Herschel Napier dug a room. He worked on it for 7 years, every evening after his shift in the mines, and every Saturday when the weather allowed. He dug 14 feet into the hillside behind the cabin, 10 feet wide, 7 feet to the ceiling. He lined the walls with dry stacked fieldstone hauled up from the creek bed. He set hand-hewn oak timbers as supports. He built a stone hearth at the back wall and ran the chimney flue up through a pipe concealed inside a dead hollow tree on the ridge, so the smoke would disperse through the bare branches and be invisible from below. He laid flat stones on the floor. He built shelves and a bed frame and a table. He dug a catch basin where an underground spring seeped through the back wall, giving the room a constant source of clean water. And then he built a second entrance. The main cellar door was set into the hillside behind the cabin, visible to anyone standing in the yard. But Herschel cut a tunnel, 4 feet high, 12 feet long, lined with flat creek stones, that ran from the back of the cellar, up through the hillside and opened behind a rock outcrop 50 yards above, hidden by a thicket of mountain laurel so dense a dog could not push through it. He fitted wooden doors at both ends of the tunnel, each one latching from the inside. When he was finished, there were 2 ways in, and both could be sealed from within. Dovie's mother had died of typhoid fever in 1929, when Dovie was 9. After that, it was just Dovie and Herschel in the cabin on Shelby Creek. He taught her everything he knew: how to garden, how to preserve, how to hunt squirrel and rabbit with a .22 rifle, how to read the weather by the color of the sky and the behavior of the birds. And he taught her about the cellar. He showed her every stone, every timber, every latch. He showed her how the ventilation worked, how the spring kept the water fresh, how the chimney dispersed the smoke. He told her, "If anything happens to me, you go down there and you stay. Do not let them take this place from you. They can have the cabin. They can have the trees. But what is under the ground is yours, and they will never know it is there." Herschel Napier was killed in a mine explosion at Elkhorn in March of 1935. A pocket of methane gas had built up in the number 4 entry, and when a man's pick struck a seam of sulfur rock, the spark set it off. The blast was heard 3 miles away. 14 men died that day, blown apart or crushed under rock so deep that the rescue teams could only recover 9 of the bodies. Herschel was not among the 9. The company paid each family $40 and called it settled. They did not fix the ventilation that had allowed the gas to build up. They reopened the same entry 2 weeks later with a new crew. Dovey was 15 years old and alone. She stood at the mine gate with the other families on the day of the explosion, waiting for news that did not come, and then news that did. She did not scream or fall to her knees the way some of the wives did. She stood with her hands at her sides and stared at the mine entrance, and something inside her went very quiet and very hard and stayed that way for a long time. She managed for 2 years. She kept the garden going the way Herschel had shown her, planting by the signs, the old mountain way, beans and corn when the moon was right, root vegetables when it was dark. She put up preserves every summer. She trapped rabbits and squirrels and smoked the meat over hickory in a pit behind the cabin. She gathered ginseng from the deep hollows and sold it to a buyer in Pikeville for a few dollars a pound, enough to buy salt, matches, lamp oil, and the few things the mountain could not provide. She was quiet and careful, and she bothered no one. The neighbors on Shelby Creek barely knew she was there. A thin girl in a rust-colored dress who came and went like a deer, who spoke to almost no one, who kept her father's place as neat and tight as if he were still alive to see it. But she fell behind on the property taxes. 2 years at $12 a year, $24 she did not have. The ginseng money went to supplies. There was nothing left over for the county. In the spring of 1937, Judge Burke Damron filed a tax lien on the Napier property. The notice was posted at the courthouse in Pikeville. Dovey did not see it because she had no reason to go to Pikeville, and no one told her it was there. The auction was held on a Tuesday morning in April. The Elkhorn Coal Company bought the 3 acres for $31. A man from the company came up Shelby Creek that afternoon with a deputy sheriff and a piece of paper. He told Dovey she had 48 hours to vacate. He told her the cabin and all structures on the property now belonged to Elkhorn Coal. He told her she could take her personal belongings and nothing else. Dovey did not argue. She did not cry. She looked at the man and the deputy and the piece of paper, and she nodded slowly, the way her father used to nod when he was thinking something through. She said she understood. She asked for 2 days, and they gave her 2 days. She spent those 48 hours moving everything she could carry into the cellar. She could not use the main cellar door. It was behind the cabin in plain view of the creek road. She had to carry everything up the hillside through the timber to the laurel thicket and down through the hidden tunnel. Every jar of preserves, wrapped in cloth so they would not clink together, and carried 4 at a time in a feed sack over her shoulder. Every sack of dried beans and cornmeal, dragged up the ridge in the dark. Every tool that would fit through the tunnel entrance. The mattock, the handsaw, a hammer, a box of nails, a coil of wire for snares, her father's .22 rifle and the ammunition, her mother's Bible, the patchwork quilts from her bed, the kerosene lantern and 3 cans of fuel, a box of kitchen things, a skillet, a pot, a tin cup, a knife, spoons. She worked through both nights without sleeping. The first night she made 11 trips up the hillside. By the 3rd trip, her legs were shaking, and by the 7th, she was crawling the last stretch to the laurel thicket on her hands and knees. But she did not stop. She could not afford to leave anything behind that the company would find and wonder about. A cellar full of supplies would raise questions. By dawn of the 2nd day, she had cleared the visible pantry shelves. The 2nd night, she moved the heavier things, the sacks of grain, the crocks, the rifle. She filled the cellar shelves. She stacked supplies along the walls. She made the bed and hung the lantern and arranged her father's tools on hooks driven into the stone. On the morning of the 3rd day, she walked out the cabin door carrying a single cloth bundle, a change of clothes and nothing else. The company man watched her go. She walked down the creek road toward the main highway, and everyone who saw her assumed she was heading to Pikeville or beyond, another mountain girl drifting away from a place that no longer belonged to her. She did not go to Pikeville. She walked a quarter-mile down the road, cut into the woods, circled back up the ridge through the timber, and entered the laurel thicket behind the rock outcrop. She crawled through the hidden tunnel, latched both doors behind her, and sat down on the bed in the cellar beneath the land they had taken from her. She did not leave for 3 years. If you want to see how Dovey survived underground while the coal company worked the land above her head, subscribe to The Hidden Harvest and tell me in the comments, have you ever refused to give up something that was rightfully yours? The company tore down the cabin within a week. They graded the flat bench above the creek and built a storage yard. Stacks of mined timber, piles of coal for sorting, a small tool shed, a gravel road for the trucks. They filled and leveled the area behind where the cabin had stood, burying the original cellar door under 2 feet of dirt and gravel. They had no idea there was anything beneath them. Herschel Napier had built his cellar too well. The entrance was buried. The ventilation pipe looked like a dead tree. The spring drainage seeped out through natural rock and joined the creek without a trace. The hidden tunnel entrance was invisible behind the laurel thicket. Dovey lived by routine. She woke each morning in the dark. There was no natural light in the cellar, and lit the kerosene lantern. She heated water from the spring basin on the stone hearth for tea made from dried sassafras root. She ate a small breakfast, cornbread baked on a flat stone by the fire, or cold bean porridge, or a jar of preserved apples. She spent the mornings maintaining her space, sweeping the stone floor, checking her stores, rotating stock, mending clothing by lamplight. She read in the afternoons. She had her mother's Bible, a Sears Roebuck catalog from 1933, and a copy of Robinson Crusoe that her father had bought at a church rummage sale. She read Robinson Crusoe 7 times in 3 years and said later that it was the only book that ever made sense to her. The hardest part was not the dark or the cold or the cramped stone walls. The hardest part was the sound. Above her, every day she could hear them. The rumble of trucks on the gravel, the thud of timber being stacked. Voices, men talking, laughing, cursing, boots crunching on the ground directly over her head. Sometimes a man would sit on the gravel above the cellar to eat his lunch, and she could hear him chewing, hear the crinkle of wax paper, hear him spit tobacco juice onto the ground that was her ceiling. She lay on her bed those times and stared at the stone above her and thought about her father's hands building every one of those stones into place. and she held still and breathed slow and waited for the sound to pass. She ventured out at night. Always at night. Always through the hidden tunnel. Always listening first for voices or footsteps on the ridge above. She checked her snare lines. She kept rabbit snares set along the ridge a quarter-mile from the storage yard. She gathered whatever the season offered: ramps and branch lettuce in spring, berries in summer, nuts and wild grapes in fall. She carried water from the creek when the spring ran slow in dry weather. She moved through the woods like a shadow, barefoot in warm months to leave no boot prints, and she was back inside the tunnel with the doors latched before the first gray light touched the ridge. Effie Justice was the only person who knew. Effie was 73 years old, and she had lived on Shelby Creek longer than anyone. She had known Herschel Napier since he was a boy. She had watched him build the cabin and dig the cellar, and she had never told a soul about either. When Dovey disappeared after the eviction, everyone assumed she had gone. Everyone except Effie. Effie walked up the ridge on a May evening, pushed through the laurel thicket the way she had seen Herschel do years before, and tapped on the tunnel door 3 times. Dovey opened it, and the old woman looked at her and said, "I brought you salt. You are going to need salt." After that, Effie came once a week. She came on Wednesday evenings because that was prayer meeting night at the church down the creek. And no one would notice an old woman walking the ridge while everyone else was singing hymns. She brought whatever she could spare: salt, cornmeal, matches, lamp oil, a bit of soap, sometimes a newspaper from Pikeville, which Dovey read cover to cover and then used to start fires. Once she brought a pair of wool socks she had knitted from yarn unraveled from an old sweater, and Dovey wore them until they fell apart, and then used the scraps to patch her dress. Effie brought news from the hollow. She told Dovey when the company men were working late and when the yard was empty. She told her when the creek was up and when the weather was turning. She told her when Judge Dameron auctioned off another family's land: the Collinses on Middle Fork, the Venters on Pond Creek. And Dovey listened and said nothing, but her jaw tightened and her hands curled into fists in her lap. Effie never once suggested that Dovey leave. She understood what the girl was doing because she had lived long enough to understand that some things are worth more than cents. She told Dovey once, "Your daddy built that room for exactly this. You are doing exactly what he meant you to do." The seasons turned underground the same way they turned above. Only Dovey knew them differently. She knew winter by the cold that seeped through the stone walls despite the fire. She knew spring by the way the underground spring ran faster, fed by snowmelt working down through the hillside. She knew summer by the heat that pressed down from the surface and turned the cellar warm and close. She knew fall by the smell of the air that came through the ventilation shaft, the sharp scent of dead leaves and coming frost. There were close calls. One October night in the second year, Dovey was checking her snare line on the ridge when she heard voices below. 2 company men working late, stacking timber by lantern light. She froze behind a hickory tree and did not move for 40 minutes while they talked and laughed, not 60 yards downhill from the tunnel entrance. Another time, in the winter of '38, a heavy snow collapsed a section of the laurel thicket, and she had to wait 3 days for it to recover before she could safely use the tunnel without leaving visible tracks in the snow leading to the entrance. She learned to think like a hunted animal, every movement calculated, every trace erased, every sound considered before it was made. She expanded the cellar during the second year. She dug a side chamber, 8 feet by 6 feet, for additional storage. She reinforced it with stones from the tunnel walls where the rock was loose. She built additional shelving, She dug a deeper catch basin for the spring and lined it with flat stones so it held more water. She carved notches into a ceiling beam to mark the days. One notch for each week, a cross mark for each month. By the end of 3 years, there were 156 notches on that beam. She was making the place permanent because she had decided she was permanent. She was not hiding. She was living. Above her, the coal company stored timber and coal and parked their trucks. Men walked across the gravel yard every day, 6 days a week. They ate their lunches sitting on stacked logs 10 feet above the room where a 17-year-old girl, then 18, then 19, lived alone with a lantern and a mattock and a copy of Robinson Crusoe. They never heard her. They never smelled the smoke that dispersed through the dead tree above. They never noticed the faint path through the laurel thicket on the ridge. For 3 years, Dovie Napier lived beneath their feet, and they did not know she existed. By the 3rd year, Dovie had worn a smooth path into the tunnel floor from the thousands of times she had crawled through it. The stones her father had laid were polished by her hands and knees. She knew everyone by feel, could navigate the 12-foot passage in total darkness without touching the walls, knew where the ceiling dipped and where the floor rose, knew the exact number of heartbeats between one door and the other. That tunnel was the most familiar 12 feet in the world to her, more familiar than any road she had ever walked on the surface. It ended in the spring of 1940. The Elkhorn Coal Company went bankrupt. The seam they were mining played out, and the price of coal had not recovered enough to make the secondary deposits worth extracting. The company abandoned the Shelby Creek operation. The storage yard was cleared, the equipment hauled away, the land left empty. When the county took the property back for unpaid corporate taxes, the same mechanism that had taken it from Dovie, there was no buyer at auction. The land sat vacant. Dovie went to the courthouse in Pikeville. She cried, standing in the open air on ground that nobody could take from her. Dovie built a new cabin on the same bench above the creek, 10 feet from where her father's cabin had stood. She cut the timber herself from the ridge above, poplar logs that she notched and stacked, working alone through the summer of 1940. Effie Justice's grandson helped her raise the ridge beam, but everything else Dovie did with her own hands. She built it small and tight. 1 room, a stone chimney, a covered porch. The same as her father had built it 18 years before. She uncovered the original cellar door, cleared the dirt and gravel the company had piled on top, and rehung it on new hinges. She kept the hidden tunnel. She kept the second entrance. She kept the cellar stocked and ready, the way her father had taught her, because she had learned the lesson that Herschel Napier spent 7 years digging into the earth. You cannot lose what they cannot find. That is what it means to build something that lasts. Not on the surface where anyone can take it, but deep in the ground where it belongs to you and no one else. Subscribe to The Hidden Harvest for more stories about the people who survived by going underground. And tell me in the comments, what would you build if no one could see it? Dovie Napier lived on Shelby Creek until she was 81 years old. She never married. She kept the cellar stocked every year of her life. When she died in 2001, her neighbors found the hidden room still full. 412 jars of preserves, neatly labeled, the oldest dated 1998. The tunnel was still clear, the doors still latched from the inside, and on the plank table in the cellar, beside a worn-out copy of Robinson Crusoe, there was a note in Dovie's handwriting. It said, "This place kept me when nothing else would. Do not fill it in."